Good afternoon, good evening to our participants in Asia, and good morning to those in North America. It's a real pleasure to launch today the Defense Innovation Talks, what we hope will become an exciting new discussion series hosted by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name is Fabrice Potier. I am Consulting Senior Fellow for Defense Policy and Strategy at IISS, and I will be moderating today's talk and the next ones we are planning until July. But I will say more about those at the end of our session. The idea of the talk series and the new research program we are launching comes from a very simple question. What exactly is innovation in defense? There are many terms out there: defense modernization, transformation, revolution in military affairs. They might overlap, but often they hide many differences. What is clear, however, is that today's military powers are placing increasingly large bets on new technologies. How successfully governments develop and integrate those new technologies in how military forces think, plan, and conduct war could well become the deciding factor between defeat or victory. However, instead of giving today a neat definition of what defense innovation is, we thought it would be best to let those leading the charge to tell us what they really mean. Because in the end, it is the military, government, and private sector leaders who will write this definition with the very priorities they set, the money they allocate, and I would say the risks they are willing to take to make defense innovation deliver a real strategic advantage. And we could not think of a better leader to meet this challenge and inaugurate our new series today than General Sir Nick Carter, the UK Chief of Defense Staff. General Nick joined the Army in 1977 and commissioned from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst into the Royal Green Jackets. He served in Germany during the Cold War, in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, in Cyprus with the United Nations, and in command of a battalion in operations in Bosnia and Kosovo. Latterly, he has had tours of duty in Iraq as a brigade commander in 2003 and 2004, and repeated tours of Afghanistan between 2002 and 2013. He was responsible on his first tour for the initial design of provincial reconstruction teams and the Afghan National Army. He commanded 55,000 NATO troops in Regional Command South during the Afghan surge, and his last tour led the transition process with the now Afghan President Ghani as the deputy commander of the NATO mission. He has been the chief of the General Staff, the professional head of the British Army since 2014, leading it through the most recent Security and Defense Review in 2015. He assumed the appointment of Chief of the Defense Staff in June 2018. In other words, General Nick brings a very distinguished record of service with strategic level appointments, giving him a unique perspective on what innovation means. And we are grateful to him, as this is General Nick's first public intervention since the release of the Integrated Review and the Defense Command paper. So I'm sure many of you are curious to hear his vision for the future shape of British military power. General Nick will speak for about 20 minutes, and I will then open the virtual floor for questions. General Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Fabrice, and thank you for reminding me of the longevity of my service. We don't grow much younger, that's for sure. But more importantly, thank you for the opportunity to speak today at the beginning of your Defense Innovation Talks. And it's great to be speaking to people both across the Atlantic and in Asia and, of course, in Europe. I think your idea of having these Defense Innovation Talks, it promises to be, I think, a very interesting series. And given the extraordinary pace of change these days, there is no doubt that innovation and adaptation, I think, are essential. And of course, it's reasonable, I think, to quote Charles Darwin when one talks about adaptation, because as he put it, he said, it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It's not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And of course, we live in a period of unprecedented change. Now, I'm going to make the assumption that those of you who have tuned in today are familiar with our integrated operating concept, which we launched in September, which informed Defence's view of the integrated review, which our Prime Minister launched a couple of weeks ago, and of course the Defence Command paper, the supporting chapter on that, if you like, which was launched last week. Now, I think collectively, these documents have delivered a most unusual opportunity. Indeed, I can't remember a time when the ends, the ways, and the means were more in balance. The ends being defined by the integrated review, the ways being determined to some great extent by our integrated operating concept, and indeed the means being the generous settlement that we received from the government in its spending review in November last year. Oddly, I also can't remember a time when the Chiefs of Staff Committee was more united. And I think that's been very obvious in the build-up to the announcement of the three documents that I referred to. Now, notwithstanding what I've just said about the ends, ways, and means being more in balance, of course, we have to recognise that there is inherent instability at the political level. And whilst I think it is tremendous that we've got a multi-year settlement, which gives us confidence to plan and programme out to 2030, there's always the risk of something undermining it. But in principle, we have got the opportunity now to look to 2030, sure in the knowledge that we have a reasonably stable programme. Now, that means that we can accept some risk in our current force structure in order to create headroom to invest in our future force structure, and indeed to utilise the significant uplift we've had in research and development funding to look properly to the future. Usually, when you emerge from these sorts of reviews, you either have a tsunami of efficiency rolling towards you, or a black hole from year 5 onwards, or for that matter, a clutch of unfunded aspirations that some wag has parked on a thing called a whiteboard. The reality is that we don't have any of those things this time round, and that therefore I think gives us an opportunity to be able to write a defence strategy, not something that we've had that I can remember in my recent time. And I'm just going to quote from Anthony Cordesman, who wrote of the DOD budget recently, that it doesn't tie spending to strategy in meaningful ways, nor does it show how a given strategy can be tied to a given region, real plans, budgets, schedules, costs, and measures of effectiveness. He says it is an archaic line item budget, which is organised largely by major categories of spending, such as personnel or procurement for individual services, defence agencies, and military services. And I think there's food for thought in that, because I do think as we develop our defence strategy, we need to make sure that it goes beyond what I think is a very reasonable question that Anthony Cordesman poses about the DoD budget and, I guess, the equivalent strategy. Now, I think for us, in writing a strategy, there are two big points that we've got to deal with. Both those points are self-evidently interconnected, and they're particularly interconnected by our definition and determination of the threat. The first big point is that we need a new strategic culture, arguably a way of warfare, for this era of constant competition. And secondly, we need a modernisation programme that allows us to modernise at the pace of relevance. And I think those are our two big challenges. So a new strategic culture for an era of constant competition and being able to modernise at the pace of relevance. Now, picking up the first point on a new strategic culture, I'm going to set it up and then draw some deductions about what I mean from that. First and foremost, the integrated review demands a more global posture that would see our armed forces engaged and committed, and less sitting metaphorically on their burdens at readiness as contingent forces. In other words, they're in use and they are at readiness to be redeployed rather than just simply to be deployed. And that's set out in our integrated operating concept, and it's predominantly about making sure that we've got the military soft power being employed, underpinned, of course, still by our ability to warfight. Now, I'd argue that this demands a very different culture. This culture for an era of constant competition is not something that we have been accustomed to over the last generation or two. You know, I grew up in the bipolar world of the Cold War. We then moved to what was essentially a unipolar world where stabilization and counterterrorism became our challenge. And we now find ourselves in this multipolar world of constant competition. And of course, as I've said many times before, it's populated by assertive authoritarian rivals who see the strategic context as a continuous struggle in which all of the instruments of statecraft can be employed to be able to achieve the effect, recognizing that they aim to win without going to war as we would define it. But of course, what they've also done is to invest quite thoughtfully in capabilities that are designed to target our weaknesses and circumnavigate our strengths. And that has been obvious because they've been able to watch it playing out in the new information domain of the last 20 years. We've therefore argued that we need a slightly different form of deterrence, a modern deterrence, which goes beyond the traditional terms of comprehension, capability, credibility, and communication to introduce competition as something we need to be doing. Now, this recognizes that escalation management is a big challenge. And it's becoming a bigger challenge because I think that there is this risk of inadvertent escalation and therefore miscalculation. And it's greater now than it was a few years ago. First, because politics has become more bellicose. Secondly, because of the preponderance of regional instabilities and conflicts. And third, because we now have these new weapons and these new domains like cyber and space, which are not regulated in the way that the traditional domains are regulated. I think it's easy taking on terrorists, which we've become accustomed to over the last 20 years, but it's quite another matter when you're competing with states, and that requires some thought. And of course, on top of that, the world becomes a more complex place anyway, with the challenges of climate change, population expansion and migration, extremism, pandemics, as we've seen over the last 12 months, questions about the Westphalian system, and of course about democracy. So my view would be that if we're going to execute what the IR demands of us, we need a new strategic muscle. And what would be in that strategic muscle, this culture for an era of constant competition? First and foremost, it's about integration. It's about integration of all of the instruments of statecraft, from ideology through diplomacy to the military instrument, the economic instrument, and all that goes with it. Now, we do that up to a point reasonably well through the national security structures that we have and our National Security Committee. But the extent to which it is agile and dynamic and proactive, given the environment I've described, I suggest is something that people might want to challenge and question. And if we're genuinely going to integrate to be able to compete, then the way that is pulled together nationally is pretty fundamental to our ability to do it, recognizing that the military instrument is just simply one of the instruments that would be applied. Secondly, we need the structures and the tools to do this. And that's one of the reasons why we're investing significantly in our network of defense attaches. We're expanding it. We're making it very clear in career terms that it's no longer a backwater. And we intend to have a global footprint that can provide genuine insight and understanding, sense and warn, but also hunt for opportunities, both in terms of where we can use our soft power, but also, of course, how it plays into the national requirement for prosperity. I think the next aspect to the muscle is we've got to make some judgments about our appetite for risk, and we must understand the consequences of engagement. We also need to recognize that it requires strategic patience, well beyond the length of a single parliament. It requires prioritization. We are a small-ish country which is not able to be globally present. There needs to be prioritization. We also need to recognize that we're going to have to sustain it for the long term. And this is going to be about depth, not breadth. And of course, we are learning and must learn from the entanglements of the last 20 years. Then I think we need to recognize that this form of competition, this form of modern deterrence, this notion of competition at the heart of it, may well require strategic communications that may well test the bounds of traditional statecraft. In structural terms, much was made when we launched the Defence Command paper last week about security force assistance, but also the creation of new Ranger battalions that would apply the same sort of risky capacity building that US green berets have played over time. This notion of train, advise, assist, and accompany, particularly with local forces, perhaps increasing our ability to be able to influence UN peacekeeping operations in a better way, or indeed playing to help others with counterterrorism. But of course, it's also about filling vacuums that might otherwise be filled by our assertive authoritarian rivals. So identifying the partners that we can work with to make sure the vacuums don't get created, but which we can help them with CT or other institutional operations, I think is at the heart of this. It's going to be about making more of our network of global basing and training opportunities, whether that's Gibraltar, Singapore, Kenya, Belize, Oman, etc. It's going to be about working with allies and partners. That's absolutely fundamental. Finding like-minded countries that will operate with us. And that may be about new partnerships. It'll certainly be about refreshed ones. It's about recognizing, I think, that the UK still has, in military terms and military soft power terms particularly, real convening power. And I think identifying communities of interest where we can work together with partners is absolutely at the heart of what the IR is asking us to do. Recognizing, of course, that all of this is underpinned by the enduring capacity to warfight. And we need to be really clear about our readiness and our resilience, and by demonstrating it, which is one of the reasons why this autumn and autumns hereafter, through a series of exercises under the mantra Agile Stance, we will be testing our readiness, our ability to outload, our ability to disperse, and our ability to protect and look after our critical national infrastructure. In this muscle, this new muscle, we will also need to think really hard about lawfare. We need to understand how our authoritarian rivals are seeking to establish new rules, and we need to protect the rules that matter to us and perhaps help others, in international terms, create the necessary rules to get after some of these new domains like space and cyber. And of course, it's going to require us in military terms to think quite hard about our command and control, how that works. It means that we will definitely invest strongly at the strategic and the operational level, and recognize that in this much broader space, we are going to need to invest again in componency, not something as the military we did much over the last 20 years when we were very much focused on land campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. So all of that requires us to think really hard about how we create and build this new strategic muscle that will be necessary for this era of constant competition. Now, the second challenge for us, I think, is how we modernize at the pace of relevance. And here I think it's very important to adopt the process of net assessment, which has been successfully used across the Atlantic for some years, but which perhaps we need to invest in, particularly on this side of the Atlantic. It's about understanding the trajectories of our potential opponents and our allies by 5-year epochs looking forwards. I think at the front end of that, let's not lose sight as we modernize of what I'll call some of the analog capabilities as distinct from the digital capabilities, because they are still going to be relevant to us in all sorts of ways, perhaps not quite in the same quantities, but they'll still be relevant for some time to come. I think we should note that we are learning a bit about future battlefields from what we're seeing playing out over the last few months or so. I personally think the future battlefield is going to be about a competition between hiding and finding, much more so than it's been in the past. And I think there are some pointers towards this from what we've seen played out over the last 5 years in Ukraine, but what we've also seen recently in Nagorno-Karabakh. I think it's showing us that mass potentially can be a weakness, as of course are single points of failure. And I think this may well challenge some of the traditional principles of war. We've always talked about economy of effort and concentration of force, and the extent to which concentration of force, if it's there for too long, becomes a weakness is something that people might want to reflect on. And of course, that means that dispersal is perhaps the solution one is looking for. But as we think about dispersal and how we dominate space, I mean ground space and land space and airspace, we'll need to think about how we exercise command and control. And our philosophy of mission command and the empowerment that it espouses is going to be vital if you wish to run something on a dispersed basis, like I think new weapons are suggesting we'll have to. Now, I've talked a lot about sunset and sunrise capabilities, but I'm just going to emphasize some of the characteristics of those sunrise capabilities, which I think are relevant to this future battlefield. Clearly, smaller and faster to avoid detection is going to be relevant to this. I think reduced physical protection for increased mobility would be relevant. Relying more heavily on low observable and stealth technologies, depending increasingly on electronic warfare and passive deception measures. Fundamentally, a mix of crewed, uncrewed, and autonomous platforms. Recognizing that getting that mix right can give you mass. If you take, for example, the air domain, and I think by 2030, it's entirely respectable for us to posit a view that a tactical formation in the Air Force will move from being, say, 8 Typhoon to being 2 Typhoon, 10 Mosquitoes, and 100 Alvino, because that is another way of generating significant mass. And you can see that playing out both in the land and maritime domains as well. That implies that we're talking in sunrise terms of being more dispensable, cheaper, and less exquisite. And of course, this has got to be integrated into ever more sophisticated networks of systems to avoid that single point of failure and to make the network spark up. So I think those are the sorts of characteristics that we're going to be aiming for, recognizing that integration and multi-domain integration across the 5 operational domains will be the turnkey enabler. Of course, we can't predict precisely what the right answer is going to be. We know that information-centric technologies are going to be at the heart of this, but it's going to be the application of combinations of these technologies that will be relevant. And that raises questions about how you back the right horses. And some of the criticism that our Defence Command paper has attracted is this sense that we're backing a single horse. Well, that's probably our failure in terms of the narrative. Because to my point about not losing sight of the analog, we also don't yet know precisely what the future looks like. Hence, we need to have a systematic campaign of experimentation, and we need to think really hard about our acquisition system. Therefore, we are creating a defence experimentation enterprise, which will be centrally directed and resourced. It'll be a coordinated program of experimentation and force development, and it will walk us towards trying to identify that future way in warfare that was described in the integrated operating concept. And of course, the key hypothesis for it to test is multi-domain integration. Now, I think in this enterprise, at one end, you'll see strategic wargaming, modeling, but in particular, you'll see the use of modern synthetic environments. And the partnership we have with Improbable for the single synthetic environment is a good example of how you can actually afford to fail, recognizing that it's less expensive in synthetics to be able to do that. And then, of course, at the other end, in terms of this way of warfare, it involves battlefield trials and tactical procedures. Now, already we have an ecosystem of innovation hubs in each of the services and in Strategic Command, and we will energize those hubs in support of this federated model, genuinely to get this enterprise off the ground and going. The key is generating a philosophy of integration from experiment to concept development to capability development to warfare development, and then ultimately to realizing the capability you need. Now, fundamentally, we can't do this on our own. It has to be done in collaboration with the private sector in a new type of relationship based on a more open and transparent two-way conversation. And that's why I would commend the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy that was launched this week, because what that does is to get after a different relationship with industry and a different relationship with our allies and our partners to maximize the potential that this all offers. I think we should also recognize, as we look forwards, that software is going to be as important as hardware in determining what our armed forces will be capable of in the future. And I think, put simply, it's all about data. The Internet of Things will collect it, the cloud will host it, robotic processing will automate it, and artificial intelligence will apply it. Hence, I think one of the most important additions to our defence inventory is a new digital foundry that will provide technical know-how and allow for rapid adaptation and innovation. In the future, I think data scientists are going to be found at almost every level in our armed forces. They are going to be the new Afghan interpreters, which give you the turnkey capacity to be able to maximize that adaptability and innovation. Now, at the heart of all of this is, first of all, our defense operating model. And I think we've got some big questions to ask ourselves, to which I'm not going to provide the answers, about the extent to which our acquisition system, and indeed the way we organize ourselves, is perhaps too siloed and is not integrated enough to achieve the effect. We are effective at acquiring platforms. How effective are we at acquiring systems? And I think how we think about our operating model and the way in which we conduct this integration across the 5 operational domains and the enabling structures to achieve that to happen, whether that's defense equipment and support or defense digital, is a big question, I think, that we need to reflect on as we seek to make this modernization work. Now, the final point I'd make is at the heart of all of this is people. They are our adaptive edge. And that's why we are investing in a modern career structure to try genuinely to maximize the talent. At the heart of it is a common skills framework, which is going to be matched to the civil sector. It's horrifying that we have nearly 350 career employment groups across the 3 services. And we're learning, of course, that we have to simplify this and we have to match it to the civil sector if we are going to attract the skills we need in the future. And we're also learning that we're going to have to manage these careers more centrally than have them managed inside the individual 3 services. And we've made some quite groundbreaking starts in terms of the cyber profession, for example, which is now managed centrally in Strategic Command. It is underpinned by a common skills framework, which means that we're very clear about the career structure across defence, out into government more widely and GCHQ, and then into the civil sector as well. And by doing that, we're pretty confident that we will begin to be able to encourage lateral entry, which is a first for the armed services, but equally to have a much more profitable and productive relationship with our reserve. And one of the things that will be announced quite soon will be the Reserves Forces 2030 work, which looks to see how we can genuinely have a more productive reserve, which will not just provide an operational reserve at 180 days readiness to be able to augment and improve the mass of our armed forces, but equally will be a home for the expertise where we need skills which we can't necessarily afford to have in full-time service. So a pretty imaginative people program is going to be at the heart of maintaining that adaptive edge, but also ensuring that innovation happens. And that requires us to think really hard about how we empower that innovation from the bottom, where the generation that matters is much more likely to understand it than at the top. So in sum, I think we have a significant opportunity, but it's going to require a relentless focus on delivery. And it needs to recognize, back to where I started from, that we will need a new strategic culture for this era of constant competition. And we'll need to think hard about how this modernization is conducted at the pace of relevance. And of course, fundamentally, that means we must retain this stable funding platform that we have been fortunate to put in place over the last 6 months. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, General Nick. This was a very impressive speech, and I would say a bit of a turning point for how we are to conceive the future of military forces. And for 3 reasons. One is we did not hear much about new gadgets, which is often the temptation of leaders talking about defense innovation. Similarly, we didn't hear much about new kind of innovation units or centers, which is another of those temptations. And related to that, I think the key message I took away is a real systemic change, a real call for changing the culture, the strategic approach. So for me, this is very telling of a really new mindset that not only British forces, but hopefully the British forces allies and partners will take in the coming years. I'm getting a lot of questions, and obviously a lot of people are keen on bringing up their different issues. But before I turn to the floor, let me use my privilege as chair to just press you on some of the key issues you raised. As you know, I mean, the innovation and the defense innovation story is a very compelling one. But there's also a dark side to defense innovation, or I would say a hard side, which is failure. We often mention the many successes of DARPA, like GPS, the internet, but I think for one success, there probably are a good dozen failures. And here's my question is, how will you make sure that failure becomes an acceptable feature in a system that is well known to be very risk averse?
No, thank you. It is a great question, and you're exactly right to put your finger on it, because traditionally in peacetime and out of an operational area, we are very risk averse. I mean, I think one of the challenges we have in all of this is if we could bring our operational and combat culture into the barracks, into the peacetime domain, then we would be a very different set of armed forces and a very different institution as defense as a whole. And it is going to be challenging for us. This, though, I think is where things like synthetics can help us, because I think synthetics can give you the chance to take risk and therefore to fail. And that is clearly something we're going to do. But more to the point, I think if we can genuinely conduct our experimentation as a genuine enterprise with the outside world, and we can match the acquisition reform to it, then I think we can share the load when it comes to taking these risks in a way that makes us less worried about taking those risks. We well know that we can't afford to do this on our own, but if we can do it with industry, and industry can be incentivized to take risks alongside us, then I think we've got a much better chance of spreading the failure that would come with it. And I think thinking about it as an enterprise is the way to go. I think we've also got to be sensible that we won't be able to back all horses. We're going to have to be quite careful about what we back. And I think being leery about how we prioritize and which technologies we're going to invest in will be pretty fundamental to all of this. And also how we burden share with allies and with partners. And I think that the defense industrial strategy that I talked about in my speech, that undoubtedly is suggesting those sorts of relationships. We've got to give meaning to them, though, because people who are watching this from industry will, I suspect, reasonably be cynical about it because we've talked about it in the past. And I think you can only really make experimentation and innovation work if you put the commercial at the tip of the spear. And I think that's how you do it. And that's how I think you spread the risk. And therefore, when you fail, more people are able to take account of that than it just being a single problem inside defense as a whole, where we won't have the culture to be able to take the risks on our own as we would need to do it. Thank you.
And you mentioned the private sector, and you also did mention Britain's allies and partners across the world. And we have many participants from different regions, the Indo-Pacific, the wider Middle East, and obviously North America. And I very much understand that defense innovation and technology is now really at the center of that competition we are engaging vis-a-vis our adversaries. But the question is, how do we make defense innovation cooperative? How do we plug and basically produce defense innovation that is interoperable with our NATO allies and our broader allies? Because there is a tension here, is that a lot of new technologies obviously have a sensitive side, either for national security reasons or for commercial reasons. And we don't always want or need to share. And yet we all know that defense innovation won't be more than the sum of its parts unless Britain and the United States and many other NATO allies are willing to work together on those new technologies.
Now, again, I mean, I think, you put your finger on what has traditionally been one of our greatest problems. I think what might change the dynamics this time around, though, I think is the influence of China. Because I think, as I said in a speech before Christmas at your rival institution, the IISS, I said that I thought that we need to think really hard about whether we are going to be prepared for China's attitude to technology and the way it is spreading its technology, essentially absorbing some of our more likely like-minded partners into their ambit. And I think that people are beginning to wake up to the extent to which some of these technologies are very likely to support an ideology that is more authoritarian, and an ideology that ultimately enables, as Yuval Harari put it the other day, totalitarian surveillance. And I think this will focus minds. And I think what it will probably encourage us to do over the next few years is to think about how like-minded communities of interest can come together to make sure that the sorts of technologies that are necessary to be able to provide an alternative to what China is producing can work more closely together. And I think that's something that we need to encourage. And that, I think, will encourage interoperability in military terms as well. Because I judge that the competition over the next 5 or 10 years is going to be a competition that will be obviously about ideology to one degree or another, but it's fundamentally going to be about technology. And that will be quite a motivating factor, I sense, for people to work together who are worried about that notion of totalitarian surveillance and all the other things associated with it. Then I think the other angle to all of this is prosperity. And I think that we all recognize now that the relationship between technology and prosperity for certainly powers, countries like our own, is pretty fundamental. And I think driving relationships with like-minded people on the basis of that prosperity will also drive interoperability and will encourage people, I think, to be a bit more open-minded about it. So I'm not saying we're going to solve this overnight, but I just think there are external forces that are going to require us to think very differently about this, and are going to require us, if we want to retain our free and open way of thinking about the world, to come together to think hard about how we combine on technology and therefore interoperability that comes with it. Thanks.
Thank you. One last question, and then I open the floor. You started your speech talking about deterrence and the need to possibly rewrite or reinvent the way we conduct deterrence and the way we keep basically some sort of stability and how we manage escalation. And indeed, this is also another tension with some of the new technologies that we are developing, mostly AI or automated weapons, where we have the technology, but not necessarily the rules that is linked to it. And I'm getting, for example, some questions about how, in parallel to doing the kind of work on software and hardware, we also were doing the work with our allies and possibly the international community on the rules that we allow to keep deterrence healthy, to say so, and to manage escalation in a way that is controlled.
Yeah, and I think there is a sense with the new US administration, which is taking a more multilateral approach, perhaps, than the previous administration, that they are looking to see how there can be a common agenda with like-minded nations to be able to get after some of these challenges. And certainly that's the way I think the UK sees it. And it's certainly what is posited in our integrated review. You know, there is this sense in there about the country being a problem-solving, burden-sharing nation. And as part of that is about trying to reinforce the multilateral system and the rules-based international system that we've grown up with since Bretton Woods and that sort of time frame. So I think that there is an increasing view that that system has got to be updated, and it's got to be updated to be able to deal with the new domains of cyber and space. And in space, we're seeing quite a lot of, I think I would argue, reckless behavior from some places, which needs to be gripped. So I think that there is an appetite, and I think there is a coalescing of views, increasing, I suspect, under the new US administration and its leadership, to be able to get after some of this stuff. Because to my mind, we've got to do this, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves with these new domains and increasingly more sophisticated weapon systems, not least some of these conventional missile systems with very long ranges, in a position where our deterrence theory and our ability to attribute actions is going to be a source of weakness. And I think the conversation is occurring, but I'm delighted that institutions like yours are asking these questions, because ultimately we need to create a bit of momentum behind the debate, I would suggest, because it's a much more unstable prospect in the world today than it perhaps was even 25 years ago.
Thank you very much. So let me now turn to the many questions I'm getting from our participants. I will start with our Director General, John Shipman. I'm relying on our great IISS technical team to allow him to ask his question. John, you have the floor. You have to, I think you have to unmute yourself. So we're not hearing you. No. So let me turn to another IISS colleague who has also served under your leadership, General Nick, Ben Barry. Ben, if you may take the floor and ask your question.
General, thanks for an extremely informative talk. The British Army has a history of both success and failures in innovation in peace and adaptation in war. What did you learn about this from your experience in the Army, particularly your time as its chief?
I think the first observation I'd make is that I took over as head of the Army in 2014, at the same time that we were coming out of Afghanistan in combat terms. And I think that I wanted to understand from the Army how it wanted to continue to retain a combat ethos. And we did something in my first sort of 3 months where we got all the commanding officers and all the regimental sergeant majors in the British Army together in Sandhurst. And we did what management consultants call as an appreciative inquiry. And I think what we learned from that was a number of things, not least the value of empowerment being translated from the battlefield into barracks. But we learned how valued that combat ethos was that had been earned the hard way in Afghanistan and, of course, in Iraq. So what I learned from that really was that one needed to think really hard about how one focused the Army's training effort. And what I tried to do was to get the Army to understand that training is a surrogate for warfare. And it really needs to achieve three things. First and foremost, it needs to be tough enough and demanding enough to create and underpin that combat ethos. Secondly, it needs to be viewed as a laboratory in which you can remorselessly drive change like you would on a battlefield. And therefore, it's got also to be an area where you experiment and you test things. And then, of course, the third thing about it, which is very much a feature of our integrated operating concept, is it needs to be in the public eye to one degree or another, so that people can genuinely see what you're up to as a deterrence, but equally working with allies, how you can improve your interoperability. So to my mind, it's really important that we use our training as a means to drive change and all that's associated with it. And I think that we were good at learning the lessons in a reasonably agile way from Iraq and Afghanistan. What we now have to do is to make sure that we create through training and exercising, and including, bringing synthetics into this, a laboratory in which we can continue to drive that change and learn lessons dynamically. But of course, it's also about studying what's going on overseas. And that's where I think understanding that our network of defense attaches need to become much more attuned to what is going on around them, and therefore better able to inform our process is also fundamental. And that does require a different way of thinking, because I think we became relatively passive in our development between sort of 1980 and probably the year 2000, or even the year 2005. And I think recognizing that we're now in this requirement to change the whole time and think about the adaptation associated with it definitely requires a slightly adjusted approach. But in my judgment, we're better at that in defense than we were. And I think we now recognize that if we don't continue to adapt, we're going to get left behind.
Thank you very much. Let me try again with our Director General, John Chipman, to see if we manage to fix our issue. John, you have the floor. No, it doesn't seem to be working. So, John, you are more than welcome to send me your question, and I will be happy to relay that. Let me maybe relay some of the written questions, then I will turn again to live questions. An interesting question on Indo-Pacific from Hiroaki Nakanishi about, to what extent is the UK willing to make a defense cooperation with the Quad, and including sharing information and interoperability in the maritime domain, including obviously on new technologies. So basically the question is, how are you stretching this notion of new strategic culture in a specific theater like the Indo-Pacific?
Well, the first observation I'd make is I think that we would need to be invited to the Quad, and we've not yet been invited to the Quad. But we are leaning very much into, first of all, the Five Powers Defence Agreement, which of course has its 50th anniversary this year. And we're leaning into our partnership with Japan, with South Korea, and of course with Australia. And in so doing, what we're seeking to do is to see where we can provide value added in those relationships in terms of military capability. And I think that we see it at the moment very much on a bilateral basis. Particularly with India, though, we are hoping to develop a close maritime relationship, particularly focused on the Western Indian Ocean. And with the deployment of our carrier strike group to the Pacific in a couple of months' time, we would very much expect to pick up the partnerships I've described with the carrier group as a means of giving some momentum to them. Now, we also recognize, of course, that these sorts of deployments are likely to be episodic, because actually the carrier group is more likely to spend its time in the NATO Euro-Atlantic area than it is perhaps further afield. But nonetheless, we will have a maritime presence that will be able to make these connections, and we'll make the connections through the other domains as well. So the answer is that the tilt, as portrayed in the integrated review, does see us leaning into these relationships in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have done pre-tilt. So I think, to your point, it's something that we definitely want to invest in. And indeed, my conversations with my military opposite numbers in Australia, India, Japan, and Korea in particular, and with other allies as well, are much closer and more frequent than they would have been 18 months ago. Thank you.
Thank you. You did mention the importance of the private sector, including also to test new technology, to fail, to succeed. Let me bring in someone who represents one of the big players, who is more on the software than on the hardware, from Microsoft, Jeremy Poulter, who might, I think, have a question also. Jeremy, you have the floor.
It's not unmuting.
Yeah, now you are. We hear you.
Hi, Chief Defence Staff. Interested in your comments. You made a few references to some of the obstacles within the Ministry of Defence that need unblocking as part of the strategic culture. If you had to pinpoint one of those obstacles, what would it be, and when do you hope to be able to unblock that and change it?
I think it's essentially around empowering the levels that matter to be able to make rapid acquisition judgments and seize opportunities. And I think it's about having the commercial function placed in the most appropriate places. Then, of course, it's about having the opportunity not to circumnavigate the process of scrutiny, but to have the process of scrutiny working in support of success and doing it in as agile a fashion as possible. And I think, we have a challenge with having the relevant commercial expertise at the relevant levels broadly enough across defence genuinely to get behind innovation. So I think it's probably about our skills, and then about the system having the confidence to allow those skills to be employed to achieve an empowered effect. And I think we will have a go at some pilots over the next few months, particularly in defence digital, which of course is the most relevant place to achieve this, to see whether or not delegating and empowering down to a lower level, making sure that the lower level is resourced effectively with the right commercial skills, and making sure that a more agile process of scrutiny is applied to it, might lead us to a more profitable and productive acquisition. So I think that's the sort of direction that I would go. I'd be interested in your perspective. Does that chime with your outsider's view looking in? Over.
I think we have lost Peter, but let me turn to another question from the defense correspondent from The Economist, Shashank Joshi, which is something you alluded to also in your speech about how do you prepare for the possibility of a battlefield where electronic warfare is more routine and effective, and where communications will be degraded? Basically, how do you deal with the fact that you are investing in new technologies, which by extent can mean you are investing in new vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think there are two observations I make. The first one I'd make is that that's why the command philosophy that we call mission command is so important. Because, of course, what that does is it starts on the assumption that you are able during your training and exercising to be able to develop at every level the notion of mutual trust and common understanding of common doctrine to achieve what you want to. So that having put that in place, you can work on the basis of giving people within specified constraints and freedoms the opportunity to seize fleeting opportunities on a battlefield. And that, of course, is fundamental if you feel you're going to be operating in a degraded environment. Now, that's not necessarily that new. You know, I can remember as a youngster serving in Germany during the Cold War. We very much knew that there was a significant amount of electronic warfare collect and occasionally jam being played against us from the Warsaw Pact across the inner German border. And as a result of all of that, we found imaginative ways to work our way around it. And of course, that's where ultimately our doctrine or command philosophy of mission command came from. I think the other bit you then need to be able to do is to make sure that you've got some alternative means of communication at the heart of it. You've got some ability to perhaps go back to analog means of dealing with the problem. And again, we exercise routinely often in Germany, in the company of the United States, in doing just that and bringing some redundancy into what we do. So I think that we are not placing a single bet on anything here. We are not for a minute suggesting that the system will be a system that will be the only way of doing business. But I do think we feel that making sure there are no single points of failure in the system is a pretty fundamental way in which it should be designed. So my judgment is that, you know, we recognize this. We also recognize that in challenging training and exercising, you can go a significant distance towards making sure that you're not overwhelmed by a much degraded environment. But it's going to ask some big questions about space and the importance of global positioning. And that's an area where I suspect it would be reasonable to say it was a work in progress.
Thank you. Let me bring up, I'm really sorry and apologize for all the many other questions we're getting, but we're also running out of time. Let me bring up a question from Anita Hauser, who is asking about how will defense procurement need to change to accommodate this new strategic focus and this new strategic culture you described? You were quite open and I would say critical about the fact that the way defense procurement operates right now is not fit for systems, it's fit for platforms. How will you think of changing it?
Well, of course, that's why this idea of experimentation is so important, because, of course, the traditional acquisition system through which we acquire platforms has been based on the assumption that you can write a requirement, you can then specify the requirement down to a real low order of magnitude, throw it over the fence for a commercial competition, and then answers come back to you in a statelet fashion over several years, maybe. And then you choose the one that's best value for money. You're really careful to make sure that you don't put any additional funding in there for innovation, because that would make it look rather expensive. You often take some of the requirement out to match the envelope, and you're left with something that is probably obsolete by the time it enters service. So fundamentally, what has got to happen here is that you've got to make the requirements up as you go along, and that requires you to be doing it in partnership. And that's why I think it would be worth picking up and reading our defence security industrial strategy, because you'll find in there that one of the things they're talking about, and I quote, is a closer and more strategic partnership with industry, earlier involvement in development and innovation. And this is about incentivizing the partnership, the enterprise, genuinely to leave some room in there for innovation, which means that the requirement and the obsessive specification that follows from it doesn't end up being a constraint to the innovation that's necessary to make sure it's not out of service, or indeed obsolete rather, by the time it enters service.
Many thanks. And to close today's webinar, let me ask you one last question, which I will actually ask to each of our guest speakers. What is the technology that is keeping you awake at night? And what is the one that is making you hopeful? I think you are on mute.
Of course, that's a good, challenging question. I mean, first of all, it would be an information-centric technology. And I suspect the one I'm most worried about is what quantum computing in the wrong hands could do to us.
And the one that is making you the most hopeful is the same?
I'm afraid it is a mirror, yes. Interesting.
Well, I can say on behalf of all our participants, a very big thanks to you and to your time for sharing with us your thinking. I think this is only the beginning of a more fundamental process of transformation and innovation, which we hope to follow closely and to stay engaged. Let me also thank my colleague from IISS and also Microsoft for their support in launching this new series. Our next speaker will be Emmanuel Chiva, the founding director of the French Defense Innovation Agency. We will also host Bob Work, the co-chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and the former Deputy Defense Secretary. And we will have a very special interactive session on China and military innovation. But let me turn to you one last time, General Nick, and thank you very much for your time and your great insights. Thank you.
Fabrice, and thanks to everybody for listening.
Pleasure. Bye.